January 1940. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The night glows orange. Flames rise from the towers of a Standard Oil refinery, painting the humid air in waves of gold and smoke. Beneath the roar of cracking columns and steam vents, a group of engineers stand sleepless, clipboards in hand, oil-stained goggles fogged with condensation. They're not soldiers, but their war has already begun. Europe burns thousands of miles away. London braces for bombers that no one can yet imagine. Faster, deadlier, propelled not by propellers, but by pure combustion. Somewhere in a German hangar, a Heinkel prototype coughs its first jet of flame. But here, in the American South, the real race is quieter. Tanks of crude oil feed experimental stills. Chemists in lab coats debate viscosity, flashpoints, and distillation curves. They are chasing a fuel no one has ever made before. A liquid that could survive the inferno of jet propulsion. A war of steel and fire is coming. But before any nation takes to the skies, it will be decided in oil. In the first years of the Second World War, aviation was still chained to the piston engine. The sky belonged to propellers. Roaring radial engines fed on aviation gasoline refined for altitude and endurance. Yet, deep inside the laboratories of Europe, something revolutionary stirred. In 1937, German engineer Hans von Ohain had proven that air itself could be turned into thrust. His prototype, the Heinkel He-178, would fly by 1939, the world's first jet-powered aircraft. It stayed secret, hidden beneath layers of Reich security. But whispers of the experiment escaped through diplomatic channels and scientific journals. To the Allied intelligence community, it sounded impossible. To the American chemical engineers, it sounded like a problem to be solved. Jet propulsion was not only about engines, it was about chemistry. The turbines demanded fuel that could endure temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, resist premature ignition, and burn with unmatched stability. Ordinary gasoline would vaporize too easily, and high-octane blends that powered the Thunderbolts and Mustangs of the skies would shatter inside a jet's fiery heart. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps quietly began consultations with its industrial partners, Standard Oil, Shell, and the Bureau of Standards, on a new category of fuel. They didn't call it jet fuel yet. It was logged as special kerosene fractions, an experimental refinement that sat between diesel and aviation gas. The concept seemed abstract. After all, the United States had no operational jet engine. No one did, except Germany, across the Atlantic. Hitler's engineers were working feverishly at Heinkel, Messerschmitt, and BMW, developing engines like the He-S-3B and Jumo 004. Their performance was astonishing on paper. Thrust levels that could cut through the air faster than any propeller plane could dream of. But those same engines burned through metal and lubricant in minutes. German scientists soon realized their synthetic fuels, derived from coal hydrogenation, weren't stable enough. They cracked, left residues, and burned unevenly. The irony was profound. Germany led in jet design, but lacked the chemistry to power it. Meanwhile, in America, the story unfolded in anonymity. The refineries along the Gulf Coast, the laboratories of Wright Field in Ohio, and the testing centers of the National Bureau of Standards became silent battlegrounds. Teams of chemists began cataloging every hydrocarbon chain, experimenting with distillation curves, and measuring combustion under extreme heat. It wasn't military glory that drove them. It was curiosity and fear. If the Germans mastered flight beyond propellers, no amount of American steel or manpower would matter. The race for fuel was not about power. It was about survival. By 1941, as Europe fell under Nazi control, the United States was still officially at peace. Yet, the American industrial machine had begun to awaken. The Office of Production Management coordinated research projects that united private industry and the military under one goal: build what doesn't yet exist, faster than the enemy can imagine it. The men who led these efforts were not generals, but chemical engineers and refinery architects, people like Frank Howard of Standard Oil, who warned Washington that future aviation would depend not on quantity of oil, but on quality of molecules. The insight was profound. If you could refine better fuel, you could power any engine the war demanded, even ones that hadn't yet been built. In those years, the term jet meant little to the average American. Newspapers spoke of superchargers and turbo engines, but not yet of turbines. In Germany, the word was already whispered in secret corridors. The He-178's test flight in August 1939, lasting barely 6 minutes, was recorded as a success but kept under strict classification. Hitler's war machine wanted more, faster, deadlier, airborne vengeance. But it would take years before the first combat-ready jet appeared. And by then, America would have already mastered the element Germany needed most: fuel. The quiet prelude to the jet age was not fought with bullets or bombs. It was fought in flasks, distillation towers, and chemistry notebooks. As 1940 gave way to 1941, the Americans were already building the foundation of an invisible empire, one made of refineries, research grants, and relentless experimentation. The sky would belong to whoever could make it burn cleanest. And by the time the first German jet touched air, the Americans had already filled their tanks. By early 1942, the United States was no longer an observer. The attack on Pearl Harbor had thrust the nation into total war. Factories that once produced cars now built bombers. Refineries that supplied civilian gasoline became the lifeblood of an air force expanding at an unimaginable rate. But deep inside this colossal mobilization, a quiet branch of the effort carried far greater consequence: the refinement of high-temperature aviation fuels. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, engineers from the U.S. Army Air Forces were collaborating with civilian experts from Standard Oil of New Jersey, Texaco, and Shell. Their mission was deceptively simple: develop a liquid fuel that could survive the punishing temperatures of jet turbines. They studied kerosene blends from naval experiments, diesel fractions from transport engines, and high-octane gasoline from fighter aircraft. None were stable enough. American chemists began to realize what the Germans had already discovered: that traditional refining methods were insufficient. Jet engines required fuels of exceptional purity, free from sulfur, unsaturated hydrocarbons, or contaminants that could oxidize at high altitude. The solution lay in hydrocarbon engineering, altering the molecular structure of crude oil through hydrogenation and cracking. What made the American effort so distinct was scale. Where Germany relied on coal-to-liquid synthesis, the U.S. possessed vast petroleum reserves. Refineries in Louisiana, Texas, and California were modified to produce precise fractions of paraffinic hydrocarbons, blending light and heavy molecules into what would become the world's first jet-grade kerosene. To the public, it was just more oil. To the military, it was a revolution in liquid science. By 1943, experimental jet engines, including General Electric's IA turbojet, derived from the British Whittle design, began testing in New England. Each run was a fiery, unstable ordeal. Combustion chambers cracked. Turbines failed. But the problem, engineers realized, was not entirely mechanical. It was chemical. Jet engines didn't simply use fuel. They depended on it for cooling, lubrication, and thermal regulation. The Bureau of Standards began issuing fuel volatility curves, setting tolerances for freezing points, vapor pressures, and flame stability. The first American jet fuel designation, JP1, was drafted in technical memos long before the term appeared in official procurement papers. At the same time, Germany was suffering under a very different kind of chemistry. The Reich's synthetic fuel plants, located in Leuna, Berlin, and Pölitz, were marvels of chemical engineering. But they were fragile. They required vast amounts of coal, energy, and hydrogen gas to produce aviation-grade synthetic gasoline. As Allied bombing intensified in 1943, production lines were disrupted. Even when operational, these fuels lacked the stability required for jet turbines. Their aromatic content caused carbon buildup, engine fouling, and catastrophic turbine failures. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the jewel of German aviation, could barely keep its engines alive for 25 flight hours. The issue wasn't German incompetence, it was chemistry itself. Synthetic fuels simply couldn't match the stability and purity of refined petroleum. Meanwhile, in America, refineries were scaling faster than even the military could absorb. The Petroleum Administration for War coordinated over 250 refineries nationwide, each contributing specialized fractions for aviation, naval, and experimental fuels. Tankers from the Gulf Coast carried refined kerosene to secret testing fields under military escort. Every new jet engine design, from Bell's P-59, Aerocomet to Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, drew from this invisible ocean of refined energy. It was a triumph not of warfare, but of logistics and foresight. America had created the infrastructure for an industry that did not yet exist. In reports later declassified after the war, German scientists admitted disbelief at how rapidly the Allies had scaled jet fuel production. Their first jets had flown before America's, but the Americans had prepared to fly forever. The race that had begun with blueprints and test stands was no longer about invention. It was about sustainability. Who could fuel the future? And while Germany's skies grew darker under waves of Allied bombers, American engineers were already planning for something beyond the war. An age of turbines, transcontinental flight, and unbroken blue. In the smoke and steel of 1943, they didn't yet know it, but the fuel boiling in those towers would power not only victory, it would define modern aviation itself. They were not on the front lines. They did not wear uniforms, but their work was as critical as any battle fought in Europe or the Pacific. At the Standard Oil Laboratories in New Jersey, scientists like Frank Howard and Dr. Gustav Egloff worked in relentless shifts, charting viscosity curves, measuring volatility, and testing experimental fuels inside custom-built turbines. Their white coats were stained with soot, their eyes red from sleepless nights spent over glass retorts and furnaces. Every successful test was a small victory. Every explosion in a test chamber reminded them how fine the line between progress and disaster really was. In Dayton, Ohio, at Wright Field, military engineers collaborated directly with civilian chemists. Many were young men barely out of graduate school, experts in thermodynamics, metallurgy, and organic chemistry. They often worked in silence, aware that what they were building would never bear their names. One engineer later recalled, "We weren't thinking about jets. We were thinking about endurance, about the kind of flame that could last." For these men and women, the war was a laboratory, and their weapons were equations. Jet fuel was not simply gasoline made better. It was molecular architecture. Every drop required balance. Low freezing point for high-altitude flight, high flash point for safety, controlled volatility to prevent vapor lock, and consistent combustion to avoid engine flameout. Ordinary aviation fuel contained light hydrocarbons like isooctane, designed for spark ignition. But jet turbines required heavier molecules, kerosene fractions rich in paraffins that burned smoothly in continuous flow combustion chambers. The Germans had pursued synthetic hydrocarbons through coal hydrogenation, an ingenious process that produced aviation gasoline but lacked the molecular consistency of natural petroleum. Their fuel was chemically pure but structurally fragile under extreme temperatures. In contrast, American engineers had something no one else did: access to naturally diverse crude oils, especially from Texas and the Gulf Coast. These contained long-chain hydrocarbons ideal for refining into stable kerosene blends. By applying catalytic cracking and hydrogen treatment, U.S. refineries created fuels that could withstand temperatures over 250 degrees in turbine combustion zones without oxidation. It was a quiet miracle of chemistry, invisible, odorless, but world-changing. The resulting blends burned hotter, cleaner, and more predictably than anything produced in Germany or Japan. It meant that, when American jet engines were ready, they wouldn't just run, they would endure. While the Germans invested vast sums in engine prototypes and secret airframes, the Americans took a broader view. A weapon was only as strong as its logistics. The Petroleum Administration for War realized early that jet propulsion would only matter if the fuel could be produced, transported, and standardized at scale. So instead of designing for performance first, they built the infrastructure first. By 1943, America had established a distribution system capable of fueling thousands of aircraft, jet or propeller, simultaneously. They constructed massive pipeline networks linking Gulf Coast refineries to northern airfields. They standardized barrel sizes, fuel specifications, and blending tolerances. Every drop could be traced, every fraction accounted for. In contrast, the Luftwaffe's logistical system was collapsing under its own weight. Germany's synthetic plants were scattered, vulnerable, and dependent on overstrained rail transport. Even if Me-262s had rolled off assembly lines in greater numbers, they would have starved for fuel long before they reached combat altitude. The Americans had built an invisible battlefield, one of tanks, pipes, and chemistry, and won it before a single turbine spun. The tactical brilliance was in foresight. The Americans didn't just prepare for the next battle, they prepared for the next generation of warfare. And as 1944 drew closer, the quiet laboratories and roaring refineries of the United States began to merge into a single unstoppable machine. The skies, once ruled by pistons, were about to ignite with a new kind of fire. War is rarely won in the skies. It is won in factories, refineries, and the endless rhythm of machinery that never sleeps. By 1943, the United States had constructed one of the most sophisticated industrial networks in human history. Over 250 refineries, coordinated by the Petroleum Administration for War, formed an energy grid capable of feeding an air force that grew by the hour. Crude oil from Texas and Oklahoma flowed through pipelines to refining complexes in Baton Rouge, Baytown, and El Segundo. There, miles of distillation towers glowed through the night, refining, cracking, and reblending hydrocarbons into fuels of unprecedented stability. It was the first time in history that chemistry had become a weapon of mass production. Each refinery operated like a frontline outpost. Workers endured heat, exhaustion, and the ever-present risk of explosion. Yet morale ran high. "We were building for the boys overseas," one refinery operator recalled decades later. "We never saw the planes, but we knew what our fuel could do." This industrial symphony was what Germany could never replicate. The Reich's synthetic fuel plants were engineering marvels, but their dependence on coal hydrogenation, a process that consumed immense power and materials, made them unsustainable under bombardment. Once Allied bombers targeted the Leuna and Politz plants in 1944, production fell by more than 60%. Where Germany's skies dimmed, America's burned brighter. The industrial balance had tipped irrevocably. In Germany, the story was both extraordinary and tragic. The nation that had pioneered jet propulsion found itself crippled by the very brilliance it had unleashed. Engineers like Hans von Ohain and Ernst Heinkel had built engines capable of revolutionizing warfare. The Hi 178, Me 262, and Arado R 234 were machines decades ahead of their time. But progress collided with reality. Their engines demanded pure, stable fuel, a resource Germany could no longer produce in quantity. The Jumo 004 engine, which powered the Me 262, ran hot and fragile. Each flight consumed precious fuel refined through desperate chemical improvisation. Technicians often resorted to blending synthetic kerosene with lubricating oils or gasoline substitutes, creating unpredictable combustion patterns. Engines seized, turbines fractured, and flames swallowed aircraft before takeoff. Pilots knew the risks. They strapped in anyway. As Allied bombing intensified, transporting fuel became a logistical nightmare. Rail lines were shattered, depots destroyed, and storage tanks left in ruins. The Luftwaffe's most advanced weapons sat grounded, not for lack of courage, but for lack of chemistry. Meanwhile, American pilots training on prototype jets at Muroc and Edwards Fields had an almost surreal advantage: reliability. Every test flight was supported by an endless river of refined kerosene, clean, consistent, and predictable. The difference was invisible to the naked eye, but decisive in the outcome of the war. Germany had the vision, America had the means, and in the arithmetic of total war, means always win. The race for jet fuel was not only about science, it was about survival. In both camps, brilliant minds worked under unbearable pressure. In Germany, chemists and engineers labored under the constant threat of air raids and political interference. Many worked against their will. Others believed they were defending their nation's survival. Their discoveries would later form the foundation of post-war aerospace engineering. In America, the moral burden was different, but no lighter. The refineries and laboratories that built the fuel of victory also fueled destruction on an industrial scale. Every gallon refined meant more missions, more bomb loads, more death. Yet, within that contradiction lay the essence of total war. Innovation born from necessity. Progress forged in fear. Historians would later reflect that the jet age was conceived not in glory, but in anxiety. Engineers who once sought efficiency now pursued endurance. Scientists who studied combustion for civilian transport turned their knowledge toward weaponry. The moral line blurred in the firelight of refinery stacks and test chambers. Still, within this crucible of conflict, a new world was forming. The chemistry that sustained jets would one day carry civilians across oceans and into the stratosphere. The same minds who refined fuel for war would soon refine it for peace. In the flickering light of 1944's refinery towers, amid exhaustion and uncertainty, few could have known that they were writing the prologue to the modern age. Spring, 1944. Europe is burning on every horizon. From the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, engines of every kind roar. Tanks, bombers, destroyers, all feeding on the same lifeblood. Fuel. But high above, a new sound begins to pierce the air. It is not the rhythmic thrum of propellers. It is a howl, a sustained, metallic shriek that seems almost alien. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, has taken to the sky. For the German engineers who had struggled for years to bring it to life, this was a moment of vindication. The Me-262 was faster than anything that flew before it, capable of 540 miles per hour, climbing through Allied formations with impossible grace. Yet for all its brilliance, every flight was a gamble. Its Jumo 004 engines, burning unstable synthetic kerosene, lasted barely 10 operational hours. The slightest impurity could trigger a catastrophic flameout. Even as the Me-262 hunted Allied bombers, Germany's fuel crisis deepened. Allied strategic bombing had crippled the Leuna and Berlin plants, the heart of synthetic fuel production. Storage depots were empty. Rail transport was collapsing. Pilots were told to conserve every drop. Some Me-262 squadrons received just 40 minutes of flying fuel per day. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the story could not have been more different. At Wright Field, the U.S. Army Air Forces had successfully tested their own turbojet engine, the General Electric IA, derived from the British Whittle design. The first American jet, the Bell P-59 Aerocomet, had already flown. Underpowered, yes, but proof of concept. By mid-1944, Lockheed engineers under Clarence Kelly Johnson were deep into development of the P-80 Shooting Star. And behind it all stood an industrial miracle, invisible to the battlefield: the jet fuel supply system. From the refineries of Baton Rouge to the testing grounds of California, America had already mass-produced enough refined kerosene to fuel a fleet of experimental aircraft and still supply bombers, fighters, and naval fleets without strain. The JP-1 T1 specification, finalized through months of laboratory trials, defined the purity, flashpoint, and stability of American jet fuel. Its qualities were so advanced that even post-war British and French aviation authorities adopted its standards. By mid-1944, while Germany's Me-262s were grounded for lack of fuel, the Americans were not only flying jets, they were testing mass production of jet fuel on an industrial scale. The irony was staggering. Germany, the birthplace of the jet, could barely keep its prototypes alive. America, which had started the race years behind, now possessed the infrastructure to power an entire generation of turbine engines. At Muroc Army Airfield in California, test pilots described the new fuels as liquid fire, smooth, cool, and endless. Engines burned cleanly, leaving no soot or residue. Maintenance crews noted that turbines ran longer between overhauls. For the first time, engineers began to think of jets not as fragile experiments, but as reliable machines of war. In August 1944, the first production P-80 rolled out. It was not yet ready for Europe. The war's tempo was too rapid. But its existence marked a seismic shift. The United States had mastered not just jet propulsion, but the ecosystem around it. Every gallon refined, every barrel shipped, every test logged, all of it spoke to a single truth: the future belonged to whoever could sustain the flame. Back in Germany, desperation replaced optimism. Heinkel and Junkers engineers proposed experimental fuels, mixtures of alcohol, benzene, and synthetic kerosene. But the results were disastrous. Engines melted mid-air. Tanks froze in winter. Even the vaunted Me-262s sat idle for want of stable fuel. Pilots resorted to cannibalizing one aircraft to power another. It was a tragic paradox. The Reich had pioneered the technology, but lacked the chemistry to keep it alive. The Americans, who had begun as observers, had quietly built the most advanced fuel infrastructure in the world. By late 1944, it was clear the jet war would be decided not by who invented the engine first, but by who could feed it longest. And as Allied bombers streamed toward German cities, their bellies full of high-octane fuel and their escorts roaring overhead, the message was unmistakable. In the new age of flight, supremacy would not belong to those who flew first, but to those who never had to stop. Winter, 1944. The German night is no longer dark. Allied firebombs turn the skies to ember. The refineries at Leuna, Pörlitz, and Berlin, the beating heart of the Reich's synthetic fuel program, are engulfed in flame. It is not an air war alone. It is the slow suffocation of an empire built on chemistry. The Me-262, the Arado R-234, and other jet marvels now sit in hangars surrounded by empty drums. Engineers work by candlelight, salvaging equipment under shattered roofs. Reports to Berlin grow desperate. Fuel reserves exhausted. Production halted indefinitely. The Reich's once proud Luftwaffe, which had dominated the European sky in 1940, is now paralyzed by invisible starvation. Without refined fuel, even the most advanced aircraft are little more than metal sculptures. Meanwhile, in the United States, the war economy hums like a living organism. The Petroleum Administration for War coordinates nationwide networks of refineries, pipelines, and depots. Trains and tankers run around the clock. At Baton Rouge, Baytown, and El Segundo, night shifts refine thousands of barrels of kerosene-based fuel each day, far beyond immediate military demand. The Americans are not merely meeting wartime needs. They are building capacity for a future not yet visible. The airfields of California, Ohio, and New York are testing grounds for a generation of turbine prototypes. Engineers log every result with clinical precision. Fuel density, carbon residue, temperature gradients. Failures are documented, not feared. Success is refined, not celebrated. It is science turned into rhythm. At the Lockheed plant in Burbank, the P-80 Shooting Star takes shape under the leadership of Kelly Johnson, the same man who would later design the U-2 and SR-71. Each component is built with future production in mind, standardized, accessible, maintainable. The United States is preparing not just to win a war, but to define the jet age. In contrast, Germany's technological edge is collapsing beneath scarcity. Engineers beg for resources that no longer exist. They attempt to run jets on degraded synthetic mixtures, with results so poor that entire squadrons are grounded. At Augsburg, Me-262 mechanics report that half of their engines failed during warm-up. Some aircraft are rolled to the runway only to stall before takeoff, victims of inconsistent fuel vaporization. A German pilot, Hans Fay, later recalled, "We had the fastest aircraft in the world, but we couldn't fly them. Our engines flamed out, and the tanks ran dry. We watched the sky slip away." That sky, once Germany's fortress, was now owned by the Allies. By March 1945, the United States was supplying over 90% of all Allied aviation fuel, with reserves sufficient for months of continuous operation. Every B-17, P-51, and P-47 flying over Europe was powered by a logistical miracle born from the same chemical ingenuity that created jet fuel. And as the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, captured documents revealed the full extent of the Reich's fuel catastrophe. The Leuna synthetic plant, once producing 300,000 tons of aviation fuel per year, was operating at less than 8% capacity. The chemical hydrogenation units were destroyed beyond repair. Germany had gambled on technology without securing its foundation. Fuel, not firepower, had become the deciding factor of modern war. In the final months, German engineers tried to save what they could. The last Me-262 sorties took off with hastily refined fuels, often blended with diesel or motor oil. Many jets crashed before reaching combat altitude. Those that did fly struck, hard but briefly. Lightning in a bottle, consumed by their own flame. Across the Channel, Allied intelligence was astonished. When they examined captured Me-262s, they found aircraft years ahead of anything the Allies had deployed, but crippled by primitive fuel substitutes. One British officer remarked, "The machine is from the future. The fuel is from the past." That contrast defined the war's end. The Allies had not just outproduced the Axis, they had outpredicted them. By the time Berlin fell in May 1945, the Americans had already standardized jet fuel specifications that would carry into the Cold War. The work done in 1942-44, refining kerosene, mastering hydrogenation, ensuring chemical stability, had given the U.S. an unparalleled advantage. And as the smoke settled over Europe, a quiet truth emerged. The race for the jet had never been about who flew first. It had always been about who could keep flying. From the ashes of Germany's ambition rose the dawn of an American century, powered not by ideology, but by engineering. May 1945. The guns of Europe fall silent. Smoke drifts above the ruins of the Third Reich, carrying with it the ashes of a civilization that once dreamed of conquest through science. Allied soldiers walk through the twisted remains of refineries, laboratories, and airfields, stepping into the bones of an empire that had run out of breath long before it fell. Among the first Allied intelligence teams to arrive are not soldiers, but engineers and chemists. The U.S. Army's Oil Intelligence Agency, a branch of the Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee, begins sweeping through German industrial sites. What they find is staggering: advanced jet airframes, shattered test turbines, and rows of empty fuel tanks. At Leuna, the largest synthetic fuel facility in Europe, investigators find hydrogenation chambers still warm from the last desperate production run. The walls are scarred with bomb craters, the pipes twisted and scorched. The Germans had tried to rebuild even as the bombs fell, welding under fire, sealing leaks with molten tar, running pumps powered by car engines scavenged from civilian vehicles. But the output was pitiful. In its final months, the plant had produced barely 10% of its peacetime target. German scientists admitted they were refining anything that would burn. When questioned about jet fuel, one engineer reportedly said, "We had the design, we had the will, but we never had the fuel." Meanwhile, in occupied France and Italy, Allied teams catalogued abandoned Luftwaffe depots. Inside, barrels were labeled with cryptic codes: J2, Sonderkraftstoff, Kerosinmischung. Wadded, many contained degraded mixtures of coal oil and alcohol, thick, foul-smelling sludge unfit for flight. In some depots, the fuel had separated into layers. The lighter fractions evaporated through months of neglect. The Allies began to piece together the true picture. Germany had fought its last 2 years of war under fuel starvation. Every synthetic plant destroyed by bombers had reduced its operational capacity by half. By 1944, Germany's total liquid fuel production had fallen to 1/6 of what it had been in 1941. Even tanks and trucks were immobilized. Fighter squadrons could no longer train, and new pilots never learned to fly. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had withered, not from defeat in the air, but from exhaustion beneath it. At the same time, American investigators at Standard Oil, General Electric, and the Bureau of Standards compiled post-war reports for the War Department. The numbers told an even clearer story. The United States had entered 1945 with over 400 million barrels of refined fuel reserves, a logistical feat no other nation in history had achieved. Jet fuel, once a laboratory curiosity, now flowed through dedicated pipelines and storage tanks across the continent. In debriefings, Allied scientists realized that the U.S. had done something no one had: industrialized chemistry. While Germany's innovations had been brilliant but fragile, America's approach was scalable, repeatable, and organized. The fusion of industry, academia, and government, the arsenal of democracy, had extended beyond weapons. It had rewritten the rules of technological warfare. The war had proven a brutal lesson. In the age of the turbine, the battlefield was no longer defined by range or speed, but by refinement. When the Allies examined captured Me-262s and Arado 234s, they marveled at the engineering. The aerodynamics were years ahead of anything in Allied service. Yet when those engines were run using American JP-1 fuel, the difference was immediate. They started faster, burned cleaner, and lasted longer. The German designs had never truly failed. Their fuel had. It was as if two worlds had collided, one of invention, the other of infrastructure. Germany had tried to leap forward. America had built the bridge first, and in that bridge lay the foundation of a new world, one where fuel chemistry, logistics, and mass production would decide not only wars, but the future of civilization itself. When the war ended, the battle for innovation did not. It simply changed its name. In 1946, the Allied powers began one of the most extraordinary programs of technological recovery in history: the transfer and study of German scientific research. Under Operation Paperclip, engineers, chemists, and physicists who had once worked for the Reich were brought to the United States and Britain. Among them were experts in jet propulsion and synthetic fuel chemistry, men who had struggled in the final years of the war to keep their engines alive under impossible conditions. They arrived in a nation whose refineries burned with endless light. For them, it was like stepping into another world, a world where fuel flowed like water, and resources were measured not in scarcity, but in possibility. At Wright Field, where many of these captured scientists were debriefed, American engineers demonstrated their advances in petroleum-derived jet fuel. The German visitors were astonished. They had spent the war forced to synthesize every drop of aviation fuel from coal, while the Americans had refined superior versions directly from crude oil in quantities that dwarfed their wildest estimates. The post-war investigations revealed a decisive truth. America's command of petroleum chemistry had won the hidden war, and that mastery would now shape the future of global aviation. By 1947, the United States had codified its wartime breakthroughs into permanent standards. The JP, Jet Propellant Classification System, JP-1 through JP-8, became the foundation for both military and civilian turbine engines. These fuels were engineered for performance, consistency, and cold weather stability, allowing aircraft to fly farther, faster, and higher than ever before. It was no longer just about fighting wars. It was about connecting continents. The first generation of commercial jets, the de Havilland Comet, the Boeing 707, and the Douglas DC-8, all depended on kerosene-based fuels derived from the same research that had begun in those wartime refineries. The chemistry that once served bombers now served passengers. Every peaceful flight that crossed an ocean carried within its tanks the legacy of engineers who had once raced to save their nations. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a different story unfolded. Soviet scientists, also beneficiaries of captured German research, focused on developing their own jet fuels derived from heavy kerosene stocks and synthetic processes. But the West maintained a crucial lead, not in technology alone, but in infrastructure. The vast petroleum network built during the war had become the skeleton of a new global order. American oil and American chemistry powered not only jets, but geopolitics. For the Germans who had survived the war, the irony was profound. Many of their ideas, their engines, their fuel equations, their research into combustion stability found new life in the very countries they had once fought. Men like Hans von Ohain eventually worked alongside former adversaries, contributing to NASA and the early space race. Their wartime brilliance had been consumed by the fire of their nation's ambition, but their science endured, purified by necessity and reborn in peace. Back home, America faced a new dilemma: what to do with the immense industrial engine it had built. Refineries once dedicated to victory now turned to growth. The wartime focus on quality and precision carried over into post-war consumer industries. Fuel research expanded into plastics, lubricants, and petrochemicals, materials that would define the 20th century. But for those who had lived through it, the lesson remained. Wars were no longer won by armies alone. They were won by systems of supply, production, and innovation. In post-war reports, U.S. military analysts summarized it simply: Germany built the first jet. America built the first jet age. What had begun as an arms race between laboratories had evolved into a global transformation of technology, economics, and power. The same refineries that once lit the night sky of Louisiana in 1940 would now light the skies over every continent. From the wreckage of the old world rose a new one, faster, louder, and powered by flame. History often remembers the weapons: the Me-262, the P-80, the screaming turbines that tore the sound from the sky. But behind every engine, every flight, there was something quieter: a liquid that burned unseen, refined by hands that never left the ground. The race for jet fuel was more than a scientific contest. It was a mirror held up to the human condition, to our need to go faster, to outthink danger, to master nature through fire. What began in secrecy and fear became the foundation of a world defined by movement. In the war's shadow, engineers discovered something profound: that the line between creation and destruction is measured not by intent, but by application. The same chemistry that powered bombers would one day carry families across oceans. The same turbines that roared over Europe would later whisper above clouds in peace. In that transformation lies the paradox of progress: that necessity drives discovery, and discovery reshapes necessity. The American engineers who once raced to outproduce an enemy would unknowingly lay the groundwork for a century of connection. Jetliners, satellites, global trade, exploration. Their victory was not of dominance, but of endurance, a triumph of organization, foresight, and science over ideology. And yet, every innovation carries its shadow. The same industrial networks that won the war also remade the planet, spreading both prosperity and dependency. The age of jet fuel became the age of oil, with all its miracles and costs. Looking back, the lesson is not about who flew first or fastest. It is about who understood that in every revolution, chemical, mechanical, or human, power comes not from invention alone, but from preparation. In 1940, a few engineers stood beneath refinery towers in the Louisiana night, watching fire climb into the sky. They could not have known that their work would ignite the future, that in their search for a cleaner flame, they would change the world's horizon. And so, the story of jet fuel is not one of victory or defeat. It is the story of how mankind learned to make the air itself burn, and in doing so, learned what it meant to rise.